Hello all, welcome back to my channel. Thanks so much for tuning in. I've got the picks for week 11 of the 2022 college football season loaded and ready to go. Before we get to those though, let's look back at week 10 and see how I did. There were 20 total picks on the week. I went 14-6, moving my overall season record to 122-28. I was 2-2 in the top 25 matchups last week, moving my record there to 21-8. And I was 1-1 in the top 10 matchups, moving my season record for those to 5-1. So things are still progressing very well this season as we approach the last couple of weeks of the regular season. Without further ado, let's get into the top picks for this weekend because there are another couple of good games on the docket and a couple of potentially decisive games or influential games for conference championships later on this season. We're going to begin with the number one team in the nation, the Georgia Bulldogs. They're 9-0, and they are coming off a huge win at home last week against Tennessee. They are on the road against Mississippi State. You might be tempted to call a letdown upset on this one because last week's win at home was a giant win. That was the biggest game of the season. Georgia dominated that game right from the get-go. They took the number one spot back from Tennessee, who had held it last week, in the first week of the college football playoff rankings. Now they're going on the road. Starkville, Mississippi is not an easy place to play. It can get very loud with all those cowbells that the fans have. So there is some logic behind the argument that this could be a letdown, a hangover letdown game for Georgia. I don't think so. I think Georgia gets this win because although Mississippi State is a nice team, if Georgia's defense could slow down Tennessee the way they did last week, they'll be able to slow down Will Rogers and the air raid offense that Mississippi State brings to the table. So I'm going to go with Georgia to move to 10-0 on the season. Number 2, the Ohio State Buckeyes. They're 9-0, coming off a sloppy win in a monsoon on the road at Northwestern. They return home to Columbus to take on Indiana. Ohio State is just simply better than Indiana. I would expect a better performance from them this week as they start gearing up for the eventual matchup later on down the road against Michigan. I'm going to go with Ohio State to move to 10-0 and keep up their end of the bargain, marching towards an undefeated matchup against Michigan at the end of the season. Speaking of those Michigan Wolverines, they are the number 3 team in the nation now. They are also 9-0 after the drubbing they issued to Rutgers on the road. They return home to Ann Arbor to take on Nebraska. Nebraska is not good this season. Michigan is going to win that game easily. They will move to 10-0, and they will hold up their end of the bargain, moving towards the eventual undefeated matchup against Ohio State. Number 4, TCU, the Horned Frogs, finally getting some love from the CFP committee. They're 9-0 as well. They are on the road this week against number 18, 6-3, the Texas Longhorns. This game, if you look at the stats, we can see that TCU is a bit better at running the ball than is Texas. Texas is a smidge better at stopping the run than is TCU. TCU is a little bit better at throwing the ball, and TCU's pass defense is slightly better, although it's so close that the difference is negligible. They're both in the low 40% range for third down conversions. They both have some interceptions to their credit. They've both turned the ball over a little bit. Texas has turned the ball over a little bit more than TCU has this season. Although TCU's starting wide receiver, Quentin Johnston, he was limited in practice this week due to a lower body injury that's been nagging him, so his status is a bit uncertain for the game, whether or not he's going to start, whether or not he's going to play. If he does not play, that is a big loss for the TCU offense. But I think even more importantly than that, my spidey sensors are going off on this game for some reason. I don't really know why, but my gut is really pushing me towards Texas. So I think I'm going to call an upset on this one. It's at Texas. It's a night game that's nationally televised. TCU's starting wide receiver might not play or might be limited in the game because of a lower body injury. Texas has been getting better over the last couple of weeks. They're climbing in the rankings, over the last couple of weeks. They played a good game last week on the road at Kansas State. They were up big, and they let K-State get back into that game, but they held them off at the end and were able to win. TCU has a habit of falling behind in games and then coming from behind to win. And how long can that magic continue? How many times can they allow themselves to fall behind and expect that they're always just going to come back and eke out wins, or come from behind and then end up winning by a decent margin? I think that magic ends in Austin this week. I think everything in this environment in this game is just screaming at me that this is an upset game for Texas. Texas is tied for second in the Big 12 standings, along with K-State and Baylor. They already have a tie-breaking win over K-State, and they play Baylor at the end of the season. TCU, if they lose this game, which I think they will, they are still going to be in first place in the conference, so they're still in a good position to make the Big 12 championship game. I know that I've said in each of the last couple of weeks that I believe in TCU, and I still do. I still think they are the favorite to win the conference, but I think in this particular context, in this situation, just my gut is really screaming at me that Texas is going to pull this one out. So I'm going to go with the Texas Longhorns to upset TCU and knock them out of the top 4 of the College Football Playoff Committee polls that will be released next Tuesday. Number 5, the aforementioned Tennessee Volunteers, coming off that road loss against Georgia. They return home to Knoxville to take on Missouri. Missouri is not a good football team. Tennessee will get their offense back on track. Missouri's defense will not be anywhere near as tough as Georgia's defense. Look for Tennessee to go 9-1 on the season. Number 6, the Oregon Ducks are the top team from the Pac-12. They're 8-1 on the year. They are they're at home, against number 25 and Pac-12 North rival Washington, who comes in at 7-2. I watched quite a bit of the Washington-Oregon State game last week, and Oregon State's defense was keeping Washington's offense in check. That was not an easy game for Washington to get through. They couldn't stop Oregon State's freshman running back and Oregon State's offensive game plan. They were having trouble with Oregon State's defensive game plan. Michael Penix Jr. could not find open receivers down the field. It was a slog for Washington to get through that game. They're now going on the road against an even better team that has a better defense and that has a better, more high-powered offense, including a better running attack than does Oregon State in the Oregon Ducks. I think Oregon gets the win on this one, although I have to admit, I'm still waiting for Bad Bo Nix to show up at some point. Although there is a small part of me that's beginning to think maybe Bad Bo Nix was in the Georgia game, and maybe he's not as bad as I had thought he was. I did not think that he was as good as advertised when he was at Auburn, but that might be because of the systems he was playing in, under Gus Malzahn and then under Brian Harsin. Maybe the Oregon offensive scheme is what he needed in order to really flourish. So maybe we're not going to get Bad Bo Nix again this season. Famous last words, because watch, he'll throw like 18 interceptions in the game and they'll lose to Washington on Saturday. I think Oregon's going to win the game. I think they're going to go to 9-1, and I think it's going to make it pretty clear that they are the cream of the crop in the Pac-12 North, and they'll be one step closer to solidifying their spot in the championship game to take on probably either USC or UCLA later on down the line. Number 7, the LSU Tigers, coming off a huge win at home in overtime last week against Alabama. They are on the road against Arkansas. I feel the same way about this game that I felt about the Georgia game. I don't think that they're going to have a letdown game. I don't think this is going to be a hangover game. Coming off a big win, they're going on the road against another in-conference opponent, an SEC West team. Only this Arkansas team is not anywhere near as good as they were at the beginning of the season. They started out fast. They won a couple of games. I think they were like 3-0 to start the season, and they've really just fallen off the map this season. If they didn't lose last week to Liberty, then they were down for much of that game. I don't really remember what the score was in that one, but they struggled with Liberty University. LSU will not have any problems with Arkansas, even if they sleepwalk their way through some of that game. I think they still have enough talent to be able to take out the Razorbacks. Go with LSU to move to 8-2 and put themselves one step closer to their championship game in the SEC. Number 8, the USC Trojans at 8-1. They are home versus Colorado. Colorado is not good. They're coming off a drubbing at home at the hands of Oregon. Now they're going to get a drubbing on the road at the hands of USC. USC is going to go to 9-1, and they will bring themselves a step closer to securing a spot in the Pac-12 championship game. Number 9, Alabama is now 7-2 after their loss in overtime on the road against LSU. They're on the road once again against number 11 Ole Miss. Ole Miss is 8-1, and they don't control their own destiny to get into the SEC championship game. Because they lost to LSU 2 weeks ago, they need LSU to lose another game in order for them to leapfrog the Tigers and put themselves in the driver's seat for an SEC West title to go on to the SEC championship game. They've had a week off because they had a bye week last week. Nick Saban and Alabama have not lost back-to-back games since 2013 when they lost the Iron Bowl to Auburn, and then they lost their bowl game a couple of weeks later that season. I think that changes this week. I think Alabama is going to have a bit of a hangover from that loss against LSU. I think with a week to give Ole Miss coach Lane Kiffin to prepare an offensive game plan, even though I'm not totally sold on Jackson Dart as being the answer for Ole Miss at quarterback, I think you give Lane Kiffin a week to prepare, you give Ole Miss a week to get healed up, to get healthy, and you get an Alabama team that is reeling and that doesn't have the powerhouse wide receiver, doesn't have the dangerous wide receiver that could be relied on to catch a pass when times are tight. The only reason Alabama was even in that game in overtime and at the end was because of Bryce Young's heroics. That's why. Not because they have a stud wide receiver like Devontae Smith or Jalen Waddle or John Mechie or any of the other ones that have come through that school recently. They don't this year. No one has stepped up into that role, which makes their passing offense less dangerous. I think Ole Miss is going to get the job done because I think they have more to play for. LSU is not going to go to the SEC championship game anymore. They are not going to go to the playoffs anymore. And Ole Miss has a chance to do both. If they continue to win their games, and if they get lucky with LSU dropping another game or so, and they go to the SEC championship game, they've got at least a shot against the Georgia Bulldogs to see if they can pull out a lucky win and qualify for the playoff. They're also trying to get back into the top 10 for the first time, not for the first time, but for the second time this season. I think Ole Miss has more to play for. I'm going to go with Ole Miss to hand Alabama their third loss on the year, their second straight loss this season. Number 10, the Clemson Tigers. I don't understand what the CFP committee sees in Clemson. I think they are overrated once again. Coming off an absolute beatdown at the hands of the Notre Dame Fighting Irish last week. They are 8-1 on the season. They are taking on a Louisville team at home that has been up and down this season, that has scored some big wins, but has then dropped some surprising games. I'm going to trust that Clemson is good enough, especially with that defense, to rebound from the loss, although I don't make this pick with a high degree of confidence. This might be a situation where they have a massive hangover from that loss against Notre Dame, and they end up dropping another game against a Louisville team that has shown that they can play good games when they want to. It seems like they just don't want to much of the time this season. I'm going to go with Clemson, but not with a high degree of confidence. Number 11, Ole Miss. I've already said I think they are going to beat Alabama at home this weekend. Number 12, the UCLA Bruins. They're 8-1 on the year. They are hosting Arizona. Arizona ain't no good. I'm going to go with UCLA to keep pace with their crosstown rival USC at 9-1, setting up a pretty titanic showdown between those two later this season. Number 13, another Pac-12 team, Utah. They're 7-2 on the year. They're hosting Stanford. Stanford is having a down year. Utah wants to try to keep pace as much as they can with the LA schools in case one or both of them stumble. Look for Utah to go to 8-2 on the year and get the win against Stanford. Number 14, Penn State. They're also 7-2 on the year. They are hosting Maryland. Maryland has a nice offense with Talia Tagovailoa in charge. Penn State is just better, though. They have a better offense. I think they have a better defense that will give Tua Tagovailoa some problems. Look for Penn State to go to 8-2 on the year. Number 15, North Carolina. They're 8-1 on the season. They're at Wake Forest, who has now dropped out of the top 25. They're on a bit of a skid, are the Demon Deacons. They had that game against Louisville where they got bombed out of the building and committed 8 turnovers. In their game last week, they committed a couple of turnovers. Sam Hartman has been throwing interceptions, which is uncharacteristic of him. Meanwhile, North Carolina's quarterback Drake May is playing spectacularly. North Carolina's got a lot of momentum right now. I'm going to go with the Tar Heels to move to 9-1 on the season. Number 16, another ACC team, the North Carolina State Wolfpack. They're 7-2, and it seems like they've got their answer at quarterback and a true freshman starter who has injected a lot of life into North Carolina State's offense. He's making some mistakes because he is a freshman quarterback, and that's what you would expect. But he's energized that team enough that I no longer am as down on NC State as I was a couple of weeks ago when I first learned of Devin Leary's injury. That Wolfpack team is hosting Boston College this week. Boston College is not good. I'm going to go with NC State to go to 8-2 on the year. Number 17, Tulane is hosting number 22, UCF, in a big game in the American Athletic Conference. If we look at the stats, one of the things that sticks out to me is that Tulane's pass defense is much better than is UCF's. Tulane is only letting up 180 yards through the air compared to the 241 that UCF is letting up. UCF, however, is a lot better at running the ball, racking up 239 yards a game to Tulane's 180 yards a game. Tulane has more turnovers in their favor than does UCF. UCF's a little bit better at third down conversions than is Tulane. Tulane is the number 1 team right now in the American Athletic Conference. They are 5-0. UCF is number 2 in the American Athletic Conference. They, I think, are 4-2 or 4-3 in conference. This game is going to go a long way to determining not only who is going to compete in the ACC championship game, because they do not have divisions. It's like the Big 12. The top 2 teams will play in the championship game. But also going to the seeding, which matters because they don't play at a neutral site in the AAC. Whoever the number 1 seed is, they host the game. So if UCF wants to host this game, they're going to have to get past Tulane this weekend. The biggest factor in this game, though, is the health of UCF quarterback John Reese Plumlee. At the time that I'm filming this, I could not find anything definitive, one way or the other, about his injury. He went out of the Cincinnati game 2 weeks ago with a head injury. He was dressed and ready to play against Memphis, but he did not play in that game. There was one point, though, against Memphis where head coach Gus Malzahn sent out Plumlee in the offense, only to, at the last minute, pull him and send in his backup quarterback, Mikey Keene, who had started the game. We think, and at least the commentators during the game thought, that he was just pulling some shenanigans trying to throw off Memphis's defense, see if he could just confuse them for a second and allow UCF to get a big play in. I do not know if Plumlee's going to start, which is big, because if he's in, UCF's offense can be ferocious. More ferocious, I think, than Tulane can potentially handle. If he's not in, their offense looks much, much more pedestrian, and I think Tulane can handle them. Because of the uncertainty around John Reese Plumlee's injury, because nobody wants to share injury news for obvious reasons, and I get it, but it just makes it frustrating for me when I'm looking up this information, especially on very important injuries like this that could sway how I pick the game. I'm going to pencil in Tulane on this one, but not with a high degree of confidence. Tulane, I think, is a good team, but the last couple of weeks, from what I've seen, they have not necessarily looked super strong. Starting out really hot against Memphis, but then letting Memphis crawl back in the second half. Then in the game against Tulsa, who was less than 500, struggling a bit in that game from some of the parts that I watched. It doesn't necessarily look like they're hitting on all cylinders, and if John Reese Plumlee is in that game, and he's on, UCF's going to win that game. But I don't know if he is or not. So I'm going to call Tulane to go to 9-1 on the season, but not with a high degree of confidence. Knowing my luck, he'll start that game and he'll throw for 8,000 yards. Number 18, Texas. I've already said I think that they are going to beat number 4 TCU at home and go to 7-3. Number 19 rather, Kansas State. They're 6-3. They're on the road at another 6-3 team, Baylor. This game, I honestly have no idea about because the stats don't give me anything here. K-State rushes the ball for 218 a game, Baylor 210 a game. K-State's defense only lets up 148 a game, Baylor's 127 a game. K-State passes the ball for 201 a game, Baylor 241 a game. Baylor's pass defense holds opponents to 227 a game, K-State 218 a game. Baylor is much better at third down conversions, 45% to 33%. They both have a bunch of interceptions. Baylor has more turnovers going against them than does Kansas State have. So nothing in this game really stands out to me. I have only seen Baylor play a little bit, and that was much earlier this season when they lost on the road at BYU. I have not seen them play since then, and because these teams seem like they're basically mirror images of each other, and I've seen Kansas State play more than I've seen Baylor, I'm willing to go with Kansas State on this one just because they are the known commodity to me. Although again, just like a couple of other picks, I do not make this one with a high degree of confidence. Number 20, Notre Dame, coming off their huge win at home versus Clemson last week. They are on the road against Navy. I do not see Notre Dame having a letdown game because Navy is having a very down year this year. So I'm going to go with Notre Dame to win another one and go to 7-3 on the season. Number 21, Illinois, coming off a surprising loss to my Michigan State Spartans last week. They are home against Purdue. Part of me is very happy that Sparty won that game because it's my team. Part of me, though, is going, yeah, but I got that pick wrong. What the hell? Why can't you do anything right this season, MSU? But honestly, Illinois had absolutely no business losing that game. They racked up more total yards than MSU, more passing yards, more rushing yards. They held the ball for longer. They were better on third down. They ran many more plays than MSU did, and yet they lost by 8 points. I think that game is a fluke for Illinois. I think it's one of those crazy games where a couple of plays turned the tide and led to the team that wasn't supposed to win that game surprisingly winning that game. When I look at the stats here, the thing that stands out to me the most is that Purdue has thrown 11 interceptions this season, and Illinois' defense has scored 16 interceptions in their favor. I think Illinois gets back on track. I think they go to 8-2 after beating Purdue, and they set up another big matchup next week on the road against Michigan. So go with Illinois in that matchup. Number 22, UCF. I've already said I think they're going to lose on the road at Tulane. Not super confident in that pick, though. Number 23, Florida State. They're back in the top 25 for the second time this season at 6-3. They're on the road against Syracuse. Syracuse has lost 3 straight games after starting 5-0. Make it 4, because I think Florida State is going to go on the road. I think they're going to get Syracuse, because I think Syracuse is falling apart. Not so much because Florida State, I think, is that much better than Syracuse, but I think that Clemson loss did something to the psyche of Syracuse. Being up by 11 points going into the fourth quarter and then dropping that game on the road against the team that has been dominating your division for years, I think just got in there. It got in there. They're living rent-free in Syracuse's collective heads. And now they're just dropping game after game after game and they're falling apart. I'm going to go with Florida State to get the job done and go to 7-3 on the year. Number 24, the Kentucky Wildcats. They're 6-3 on the year. They are home versus Vanderbilt. Vandy ain't no good. Go with Kentucky to go to 7-3 on the season. And then finally, as I said earlier, number 25, Washington. They are going to lose on the road against Oregon. And that does it for Week 11 of the 2022 college football season. Leave me a comment below. Where do you think I've gone right in my picks? Where do you think I've gone wrong in my picks, and why? What do you think I'm miscalling here? What do you think I'm not taking into consideration in these picks? Also, leave me a comment. Let me know what game or games you're particularly excited about watching this weekend. Thanks so much, as always, for tuning in, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in the next video.